In a pretty surprising move, Sony INZONE has recently launched their M10S, a 1440p 480Hz OLED gaming monitor that's a direct competitor to the Asus PG27AQDP. They did a few things right, they missed a couple major things, including a proper warranty, and their big standout feature, offering DisplayPort 2.1, is at best pointless and at worst feels misleading to consumers. This one's gonna be a little rough. First off, thanks to Sony INZONE for sending this out for review, but before we even dive into specs, it's important to understand that very few modern games can even really take advantage of 480Hz. I mean, it's really down to like Valorant, Overwatch 2, CS2, maybe Rainbow Six Siege, and Fortnite. We're talking light-lift competitive FPS games. I do like 1440p 27" as an overall sweet spot for gaming, especially if you don't have the GPU muscle to game at 4K, but unless you're really into competitive FPS, 240Hz is going to give you a great experience at a much lower price point. This monitor comes in at $1,099.99, whereas a nice 240Hz OLED will get you for about $400 less. It is true that the higher your refresh rate, the lower your input latency. Here you can see the values for 240, 360, and 480Hz on this monitor. This is technically a performance boost, but unless you're playing games and have a machine that can consistently hit 480Hz, I don't see this being meaningful enough on its own to justify the price. The M10S is using the same LG WOLED MLA Plus panel that we saw in the recent Asus, and the coating here is still matte. The most impressive thing about this monitor to me is the industrial design. The entire panel is balanced on this little disc that's only 4mm thick. I don't think I've seen a smaller footprint so far. They definitely took esports into account here. This monitor was designed in conjunction with the esports team over at Fnatic. Despite that tiny base, it's really sturdy. You'd have to try to knock this thing over. You get height, tilt, and swivel, but no pivot at all, even to compensate for leveling, so you're not going to go full vertical on the stock stand. You can't vase mount this on an arm though with no adapter. Overall, it's probably the cleanest visual presentation I've seen too. There's no visible controls, logos, lighting, anything on the front. Looks really sharp. On the rear, it's just a couple logos, the joystick controls, and a fat heatsink made it to the panel. There are height markings molded into the stand, but any other adjustment markings use stickers that you apply to the base, which, no. I/O is where things start to get interesting. We've got headphone out, 2 USB Type-A down, 1 USB Type-B up, 2 HDMI 2.1, and 1 DisplayPort 2.1, which they're happy to advertise and bake into the cost. Now, to be clear, DisplayPort 2.1 isn't something that we need right now. At the time of this video, there's like 3 AMD GPUs that support this and none on the NVIDIA side. It's currently looked at as a means of future-proofing your monitor purchase, as everyone is assuming that the next wave of GPUs will all use DisplayPort 2.1, and people generally keep their monitors a lot longer than their other components. See, 480Hz at 1440p is a lot of data, so much so that we can't even do it today without using something called DSC, or display stream compression. Using this compression isn't even generally noticeable to the end user visually. Most people happily run DSC on their setup every day without even knowing it's a thing. On NVIDIA cards specifically, it usually only shows up when you Alt-Tab out of a game, and Windows takes a couple seconds to get situated. DisplayPort 2.1 is going to offer a lot more bandwidth than the current 1.4. The issue is that there's 3 levels of standard baked into that. The RSFO32 U2P from Gigabyte that we looked at recently offers UHBR20. This is the full fat version. It allows for data rates of up to 80 gigabits per second. For context, pushing 1440p at 480Hz with 8-bit color needs around 56 gigabits per second, and 10-bit color would need just over 70. The issue here is that Sony has opted to go with the lowest performance tier and still be able to say it's DisplayPort 2.1. They're using UHBR10. That maxes out at only 40 gigabits per second, so our 1440p 480Hz stream won't fit in that without still using DSC. So again, at best, it's a pointless inclusion. Now, Sony was nice enough to reveal that, but you have to go down into the fine print under the specifications section to discover that. Most people are just going to see DisplayPort 2.1 and think they're getting a win. They're also nice enough to include a DisplayPort 2.1 cable. It too is labeled as being 40 gigabits max. It's also worth noting that aside from a power cable, this is the only cable included with this monitor. Understand they are technically within their right to do this, as the current spec is a mess, but advertising a marquee feature and then providing a nerfed port isn't really what you want to see out of a monitor at the top end of the price spectrum. How much you care about this depends on how much you care about DSC, but I didn't think it was right to see this and not call it out. I think it's really important that we set the standard with brands early on with this thing. I have reached out to Sony for some clarification on this, and on the off chance they get back to me and they tell me that limitation is because of the included cable and not the actual port, which would be weird, I will happily release a short explaining all that. that. Now keep in mind that none of this affects the actual use of this monitor as a 480Hz gaming monitor, and 480Hz feels very nice if you have a system and games that can achieve it. OLED just looks amazing in person. It's got an infinite contrast ratio and an inherent gray-to-gray transition time that's much lower than other display tech, so we still see that sub 0.1 millisecond gray-to-gray that we've seen on every OLED so far. I wouldn't say that 480Hz is a big jump from 360. It's much more noticeable if you're coming from like 144 or 240, but you feel it right away, like as soon as you're on the desktop and you see the way your cursor moves before you even get into a game. We can also see it in the motion blur performance. Here's what this monitor looks like running at 240, 360, and 480. 480Hz OLED is really solid. It even beats out 540Hz TN panels. It only gets beat by panels running a backlight strobing tech like Diac2 or ULMB2, and even then the main image may be more clear, but you're still getting a little doubling, so it's very impressive. Instead of backlight strobing, OLED monitors use black frame insertion because there's no backlight on an OLED. All the pixels light individually. Unfortunately, there is no black frame insertion mode on this monitor like we have on the Asus monitor. Remember that using BFI essentially splits your hertz in half. Your monitor might say it's running 480Hz, but really it's one live frame, then a black frame, then a live frame, and so on, effectively running at 240Hz. So it offers no benefit to 480Hz gameplay, but it really cleans up 240Hz. It gives it the same motion blur performance as 480Hz, but in FPS it's a lot easier for your games to hit. It does come with a pretty substantial hit to brightness, but it's a great feature to have on a monitor like this where the majority of your games are not going to be taking advantage of that 480Hz, so it's a big miss that we don't have any support for that here. Brightness here for full screen SDR comes in right under 265 nits in standard mode, which is solid for OLED. The monitor ships in game mode as default, which has a really blue tint to the colors and a white point of nearly 7600, while 6500 is considered accurate. Moving into standard mode sees 6300 and a slight warm tint. Delta ITP here is 5.3, and we really want to see 3 or under on this. They do give you a lot of flexibility in how you can adjust the color on this monitor, but the factory calibration here isn't really dialed in for accuracy. We do have plenty of color coverage here. We get 97.3 DCI-P3 coverage. It does come with that OLED wide gamut, like punchier colors that we're used to seeing that can be oversaturated for certain content, so there is an sRGB mode here if you want to do something more accurate, but accuracy doesn't really feel like it was the goal for this monitor. All the included color modes are designed to give a very specific gaming experience. FPS Pro gives you a saturation and a contrast that mimics what you'd see like on a Zowie TN monitor, brighter, more washed out. It's supposed to be for people who are more used to playing on a non-OLED monitor. FPS Pro Plus is a super heavy contrast mode that favors red, so it emphasizes outlines on games that already have red outlines for enemy players. To be clear, this is thankfully not some new AI garbage that adds red outlines to enemy players in games that don't already feature that. It's important to note too that despite the naming scheme here, all these modes are for color adjustments only. None of these affect the actual input latency of the monitor. If you're using your PS5 on this, it will auto-select either cinema or game mode depending on the content you've selected. Nice touch. We also have a mode here to reduce the screen size to 25 inches for those of you that just perform better on a smaller display size. You can just hit down on the joystick to toggle this mode really fast. I like that you can set this to either be in the center of the screen or on the lower edge. Again, because OLED pixels turn completely off, the borders are completely black, not some version of backlit gray, so I don't find this mode to be distracting at all. It defaults to a resolution of 2368 by 1332, so it preserves the proper pixel scaling, but you can run this in 1080p if you need to squeeze out some additional frames. It's obviously not as sharp looking, but it's totally playable. Running in this mode doesn't add any additional input latency. Just be aware that you cannot use this and variable refresh rate at the same time. VRR here is G-Sync compatible, and unfortunately we do have very obvious VRR flicker on this monitor, both in the testing app and in game. And also, unfortunately, they have not included any kind of anti-flicker mode to reduce the effective range of VRR to help mitigate any of that. One of the beauty parts of OLED is HDR, because again, those self-lit pixels means no dimming zones. You can have black right up against white and there's no spill or haloing. We've got 4 modes here on offer and they're all pretty rough. Game HDR is able to achieve a 1% window brightness of 1251 max, and that's how they can get away with claiming 1300 nit peak brightness, but it falls off really sharp. The EOTF tracking is a disaster here too. It's way too bright across the entire spectrum and then still somehow manages to fall short at the top end. Looking at their display HDR True Black 400 mode, which is considered their accurate mode, we see more consistent brightness at the top end of around 450 nits max. Normally in this mode, what we see is decreased brightness in exchange for better accuracy. But here, the tracking is still pretty rough as far as objective measurements go. To add some context, here's the same measurement on the PG27AQDP where it's essentially nailed in this mode. Subjectively, it's just okay. The HDR 400 mode feels pretty flat. The highlights don't really pop. There are some crushed blacks and a greenish tint I haven't noticed before on any other monitor. It's a better experience in game HDR mode. The highlights pop for sure, but the whole scene is brighter than it should be. Now, luckily in this mode, they leave all the picture adjustments unlocked, so you can dial down the brightness and adjust adjust the contrast and saturation to get something that looks good to the eye. It's not perfect by any stretch. But the thing is, you're paying a price premium for OLED, so you should be able to take advantage of everything that OLED offers. The fact that we're seeing better performance from a different manufacturer on the exact same panel just comes off lazy, and Sony really needs to address this. Because they're using the newest MLA Plus W OLED tech from LG, it means we also get the new subpixel layout of RGWB, and that results in some of the best text clarity I've seen from OLED yet, even at 27-inch 1440p, which is a lot less forgiving than the 4K panels. We also have a handful of common anti-burn-in features that we've seen a few times, and Sony talks a lot about their heatsink tech, but here's another glaring issue for me. As time goes on, I'm getting less concerned about burn-in, but the industry standard warranty for these high-end OLED monitors is 3 years with specific coverage for burn-in. Sony's warranty here is a limited 1-year warranty with no verbiage about burn-in. This to me is just unacceptable for a purchase at this level. If Sony really believes in everything they've done to mitigate burn-in here, they believe in their heatsink, then they need to put their money where their mouth is. So talking value, this monitor again is $1,099.99, so $1,100. That's $100 more than the competing Asus model, and I'm not seeing $100 worth of difference. Between the low performance DisplayPort 2.1, the single included cable, the worst factory calibration, the poor HDR, the lack of backlight strobing tech, the VRR flicker, and the abysmal warranty support, there's just not a lot of positive here for me. The most impressive part of this monitor is the industrial design, the clean bezels and the stand, which I do greatly prefer over the Asus stand, even though it lacks any pivot. And it does function well and look beautiful as a 480Hz SDR gaming monitor. I don't want to sell that part short. But 480Hz is already such a niche buy right now, and to see Sony miss on so many fronts means I can't recommend this as a buy in its current state. Thanks again to Sony INZONE for sending this out, but it feels really phoned in, and they've got to know that's not going to cut it if they want to compete at the top end of the PC gaming market.